and welcome to the Consider This channel. This is Chapter 13, of Evidence of Soul by Sharon Patrice. The Curious Case of the Royal Oak Pub. Some things, situations, or presented realities defy scientific, plasma-orientated, religious, or a common-sense explanation. One could introduce quantum physics or the weirdest spiritualistic claims, and yet still nothing addresses, with an acceptable continuum of soul, nor does any explanation, in any way, bring a comfort to what we thought we knew, or could at least produce a theory on, like the curious case of the Royal Oak Public House in Hurstton, near the sandy bay of Swanage, on the Isle of Purbeck, Dorset, UK. The Royal Oak has the widely acknowledged reputation of being haunted by spirit. Not just one spirit, but several. These spirits, earthbound souls, apparitions, or whatever you choose to call them, have been witnessed by numerous people visually, physically, and heard. In fact, according to one set of American paranormal investigators, Nick Groff and Katrina Weidman, of 72-Hour Paranormal Lockdown, it is the most haunted public house in England. But, let us stop this right here. The most haunted. What does that even mean? Given what we have detected and suspect as the very beginnings of life on planet Earth, and the probability of one's soul as an energy form, perhaps continuous in nature, why would the natural energy forces of the departed hang around an old pub or any building for that matter? Background. Our background starts with a woman by the name of Mary Webber, born 1820, Worth-Matravers, Isle of Purbeck, Dorset. After her birth, the family move a mile or so inland to Langton-Matravers, the next village west of Hurstton. Mary married a local harness maker by the name of John Ball in 1853, Langton-Matravers. All seemed well, and in 1855 they were blessed with a son, Henry. Some years later they purchased, freehold, and moved into the Ship Inn, a tiny two-story alehouse in Langton-Matravers, as landlord and landlady. Late one cold December night, in 1878, after kicking out time at the pub, so the story goes, Mary was upstairs getting ready for bed, when she overheard her husband plotting to murder her. Either he was speaking to himself very loudly, or there was an accomplice, or at least someone who knew his plan. She climbed out of the upstairs window, and ran across the fields to her parents' cottage. He was going to shoot me, she told her parents. The very next morning John was found dead at the Ship Inn. He had shot himself with a shotgun. Another version of the same states, John was drunk when he retired to bed. An awful fight broke out between himself and Mary, but Mary managed to escape running over the fields to her parents' cottage. Both interpretations conclude John shot himself with his shotgun. A suicide burial was given to John Ball, which led the local reverend, the Rev Lester, to protest that John Ball had been buried like a dog. He asserted, John must have been suffering from depression. He had attempted to kill his wife Mary, and then turned the shotgun on himself. A campaign headed by the Rev Lester resulted in a change to British law to enable such unfortunate people, suffering from a mental illness, to be given a proper churchyard funeral. If John was a depressed drunk, it did not show in his day-to-day dealings, as he also sat on jury service that same year, qualified to do so by being the owner of his own freehold land and successful business. Mary's sister, Sindonia Webber, born 1816, Langton-Matravers, married Thomas Stevens, a local stone mason odd jobbing as a labourer, when needs be, in the summer of 1843, and together set up home. Within a few years, they moved into the Royal Oak Public House, Hurstton, about a mile, that's around 1.6 kilometres, from the Ship Inn, Langton-Matravers. Thomas and Sindonia had also purchased the pub and large garden to the back freehold. In those days, the Royal Oak Pub consisted of the main bar accessed, for customers, through the door at the front left-hand side of the building, and a snug bar, accessed through the front door on the front right-hand side of the building. One frontage, two doors, leading to two separate bars. On the left-hand side of the pub, looking at it from the front outside view, are three attached cottages built in the same era and stone design. Next door on the right were two cottages attached to the Royal Oak. At the back of the Royal Oak, attached and interconnected to the pub, was another building, which spanned the entire length of the pub. At the far side, that building led out back to a large garden through a wide door on the right-hand side. There were two doors adjacent to each other on the left-hand side and formed a small, enclosed space, a little like a small lobby. One door led out to a right-of-way, across the back of the attached cottages, to the lane at the far left side of the back property named Benlease Lane. The other door opened to a flight of stairs that lead to the first floor of the back building and a small hallway landing to the first floor frontage. On that floor were possibly 4 rooms, 2 at the front as suspected by the windows and 2 at the back likewise. A further stairway roughly situated where the back and front buildings met went up to the top floor, which consisted of 2 further rooms in the main taking up the attic space. There were no rooms in the attic space of the back building, which informs us the front of the Royal Oak was a 3-story building, and the back was simply 2 stories, and quite obviously, originally, a separate building. Thomas and Sidonia stayed at the Royal Oak pub from October 1848 to January 1878, and raised 3 children, 2 to adulthood. However, it may be that their first pub was not the Royal Oak at Hurstton, as when their firstborn, Thomas Jr., August 1845, Langton Matravers, was baptized, his father's place of abode and profession was given as Langton Matravers Innkeeper. Thomas Jr. grew strong, and became a quarryman, freeholder, stone mason, and stone merchant. At the age of 48, in 1893, he married Mary Dowland from Bournemouth. Their marriage produced no issue. On Thomas and Mary's marriage certificate, he was described as a bachelor. He died at the age of 51 in 1897. In 1847, Thomas and Sidonia were blessed with another son, whom they named John. John was christened in Langton Matravers, with his father's occupation again given as innkeeper and again as living in Langton Matravers. He also took up the profession of stone mason, stone merchant, and farmer. John appears to have been a bit of a silly boy in his youth, when on the 2nd of May, 1866, he was imprisoned at Dorchester for stealing an oil cake. Upon his release, some 2 months later, he went to London and married Caroline Elizabeth Dix, a London girl, on the 7th of July, 1866. Within a few years the pair were blessed with 4 children: Elizabeth, 1868, Hurstton; Thomas, 1870, Hurstton; Louisa Jane, 1872, Hurstton; and John Charles, 1875. Unfortunately, Caroline passed away March 1876 at Worth Matravers, a couple of miles away, where the pair had taken Eastington Farm. She was found dead on the beach from drowning, a suspected suicide. It was not long before John married for a second time repeatedly. He chose a London girl. In September 1876, London, he wed Mary Jane Savage and took her back to his farm at Worth Matravers. This marriage produced Sidonia, 1878, Robert, 1880, Harry, 1883 and Laurie, 1885. Mary Jane died in April 1898 at the farm, and unfortunately their daughter, Sidonia, also died at the farm in September of the same year. John and Caroline's daughter Louisa Jane did not stay at Eastington Farm after the death of her mother, but instead moved in with her grandparents, Thomas and Sidonia. John died October 1915 at Easington Farm, Worth Matravers. Thomas and Sidonia were blessed with another son, Robert, born on the 17th of November at the Royal Oak, literally 4 weeks after moving into the pub, but, sadly, he may have been stillborn or at least died the same day of his birth. Next and lastly came a daughter, Elizabeth, in 1852. Unfortunately, she died in July 1859, at the tender age of 7, at the Royal Oak pub. Thomas worked hard not only in fashioning the locally quarried Purbeck stone, but also stood as a merchant of stone, while raising his family at the Royal Oak, and wearing his separate income hat of publican of his own freehold public house. In 1850 Thomas is registered, as an innkeeper and freeholder, for the first time as a member of the jury in the courts of Wareham, at the time the main town on the Isle of Purbeck, although not strictly in Purbeck, but it does straddle the boundary. He had gone from a stonemason, descended from a line of simple stonemasons, to a freehold owner of property, an income from his merchandising of stone as a stonemason, and of course, his licensed victualler's money-making activities, on a daily basis, at the Royal Oak. Thomas and his family grew financially from strength to strength. Thomas and Sidonia left the Royal Oak pub and moved into Laurel Villa, a grand house in the style of a manor house, and just a few stone cottages down the high street from the pub. However, Sidonia died there January 1881. Her sister Mary had moved into Thomas and Sindonia's family home by April 1881, and lived with Thomas, his son Thomas Jr. and his granddaughter, Louisa Jane, at Laurel Villa. Mary was described as housekeeper on both the 1881 and 1891 census publication. Mary died later in 1891. Philip Clare Moss was born in 1824, the son of Henry and Martha Moss. Henry was a blacksmith from Corfe Castle, around 5 miles, that's roughly 8 kilometers, from Hurstton. Philip, as well as all other sons blessed to Henry and Martha, followed in his father's footsteps and became a blacksmith. In December 1851, Philip married Louisa Pond, a local Swanage girl, and together they set up home. Within a couple of years, they moved into one of the cottages next door, on the left-hand side to the Royal Oak, and proceeded to have 10 children. Lavinia, 1852, Albert Moss, 1854, also known as Thomas Albert Moss. John Henry Moss, 1856. John was also known as Henry. Elizabeth Moss, 1859, Hurstton, baptized in Swanage, but no marriage nor death records have been found for her. Martha Clara Moss, 1860, Maria Moss, William Moss, 1865, Frederick Moss, 1867, and last but not least, Frank Moss, 1870. By 1881, Philip Clare Moss had moved with his family just down the road to Bell Street, Hurstton, and was still working as a blacksmith. By 1901, Philip was registered as both deaf and blind and had long since retired. One other blacksmith is noted in the recorded national census as living next door but one, which would have been the second cottage along from the Royal Oak, and what is possibly the kitchen, and the further 2 floors of the left-hand side of the modern-day pub. His name is Frederick Billett B. 1846, Norden, near Corfe Castle. His wife Elizabeth, who had been married once before, and had several children by her first husband, was from Pideletronthide, Dorset, many miles away from Hurstton. In 1871 they are recorded with 3 children: George, 1865, Lychet, Dorset, and 1867, Lychet, and lastly a son named Eli, born in 1870, Swanage. Unfortunately, and died at the age of 21 years in 1888, and is buried in Swanage. In 1891, Frederick is registered as in the house next door to the Royal Oak and still working as the local blacksmith. The landlord at the pub is now one Henry Haysom, a local man who is described as occupier and keeper. This tells us Thomas Stevens had not sold the freehold of the pub, so either leased it out or installed a tenant landlord. By 1901, the Billett family had moved to Jubilee Street, one of the 2 primary streets of Hurstton at the time. Frederick still ran his own blacksmith's business. Sometime during the late 1980 or the early 1990s, 2 of the cottages attached to the left-hand side were added to the pub, and interconnecting doorways knocked through. The ground floor of one cottage became a restaurant and the other the restaurant's kitchen. The 2 second levels now attached became 1 bedroom and 1 room used as a sitting room. The top floors became a further 2 bedrooms. By this point in the Royal Oak's history, it was owned and had been for some years by a brewery, which left all landlords and landladies tied to that brewery. According to a survey of historic Hurstton by British History Online, the Royal Oak pub and the small row of terraced cottages attached were built between late 17th century to early 18th century. However, that's not strictly true, if at all. The modern Royal Oak is made up of 4 buildings, 3 of which front the pub as is seen today, and were built around 1848, but the 2-story building at the back tells a hugely different story. In the Dorset Tithing and Land Tax Assessment for Hurstton 1818, the Rev. Samuel Serrell is shown as owning land and premises that he calls Durnford and Serrells in both Hurstton and Langton Matravers. He is assessed and exonerated from £19 and 12 pence shillings, which is by far more than any other landowner in Hurstton or its surrounding areas. His family owned and lived in the mansion house known as Durnford Hall in Langton Matravers, and he personally owned a considerable amount of land in Swanage and Hurstton. The land the Royal Oak sits on was also owned by the Reverend Samuel Serrells, and in the 1840 Tithing and Land Tax Assessment for Hurstton, the Rev is shown as owning a large section of land he identifies as Ben Ledge. Ben Ledge is traced as being owned by the Serrell family as far back as the will of Samuel Serrell of Langton Matravers, who died in 1744, where he names land called Bindledge in the Isle of Purbeck, as well as many other lands in the area, being left to his son. The map of Bindledge, now spelled Benledge, for the 1840s tithing and land tax is the same map also for the 1841 tithing and land tax. It shows a large dwelling, possibly a farm, just off the main road that leads from Swanage through Hurston and onto Langton Matravers. Alongside, at a short distance, is a separate smaller building situated just of the road, and is quite obviously the old building at the back of the modern-day Royal Oak. On the corner of the land near to the smaller building is an even smaller building, which faces the road, and next to that is a small track that comes from the main road onto the land. To access these buildings one could, by foot, enter through the main road, one might imagine, but to enter the land by horse, cart, or carriage one could only access the land via the small track at the side. Today that small track is known as Benlease Way, and enters a built-up modern housing development. The name Benlease is a time-brought bastardization of Benledge and originally Bindledge. All cottages on the left side of the Royal Oak have a right-of-way over their land, directly in front of their back door, leading from Benlease Way to the back door of the old building at the back of the pub. This is what happens when you parcel up a chunk of freehold land. The right of the original house will still have the right to enter its property by the same route as before. The chunk was divided into smaller freeholds. Benledge on the right-hand side of the pub was also portioned up with a dividing line going from the old building at the back of the pub. All new houses or cottages also have a right-of-way from the main road leading to the back of the cottage next door to the pub. This shows us Benledge was indeed one piece of land, as the historic maps confirm. Just as a curious fact, Bindledge originally meant bent ledge and fits the topographic anatomy of the land accurately. The hauntings. In or around 1999, a new landlord and his family moved in. They were not downbeat by the physical degenerate condition of the building, and set about bringing in tradesmen to clear sores, among other things, and rebuild flooring on the first floor hallway. Much of the Royal Oak was in such a shocking condition that their opening night had to be postponed until health and safety was completed to allow the public in. Everywhere had a fresh coat of paint. The front bar area had white walls with a red and black theme to the actual bar. Tables were decorated with backgammon and chessboards designed by local artist Kevin Vickers and lacquered in place. Fresh bulbs and seasonal plants were placed in window boxes outside the frontage of the pub and the front bar. By now the two separate bars had been knocked into one, and the new landlord had the main bar's parquet flooring re-established. A large picture of historic quarrymen at a local quarry, spanning at least half of the front bar ceiling which had been screwed in place, was removed and relocated to the wall connecting the gents' toilets to the outside hallway. The jobs never seemed to end. In the back bar, the new landlady noted after painting the walls numerous times throughout a 4-day period, a particular piece of wall would not dry. Her husband called in a trusted local builder, known as Butch, to take a look. It was discovered behind the old and somewhat wet plaster existed a purpose-built hole in the wall, around 18 inches wide, that's roughly 45.7 centimeters, and about 12 inches deep, that's 30.4 centimeters. It was possible the hole had been a window at some point in time, except the stonework on the outside of the building gave no evidence to that theory. The hole in the wall was exposed and left to dry and became something of a curiosity. What should have been a large, pleasant garden at the back of the Royal Oak looked more like a bomb site. A large section of the dry stone wall on the back boundary had collapsed and was dangerous. A huge bonfire had been set up at some point, and the land it had occupied was burnt black with old metal bike frames and melted rubber strewn throughout. The landlady helped the worker to clear the garden, and while up near the top wall left-hand boundary found what looked like a vertebra along with very worn pit pony shoes. This area would have been at the back of either the first or second cottage before being incorporated into the Royal Oak pub. The vertebra was not fossilized and presented as possibly human. The landlady took the bone to the local police station and asked them to identify whether or not it was human. About a month later she went back to the police station where she was told it was indeed human, but as it was likely to be 200 to maybe 300 years old, they would not be investigating. Going back to the first night the landlord and his family moved into the Royal Oak, numerous strange observations were discussed the next morning over breakfast. Their 14-year-old daughter was first to complain. Who was going up and down the stairs all night, she asked. No one, came the reply from her mother. Well, someone was. I couldn't sleep. It was like they were wearing heavy boots. Their daughter's bedroom was on the first-floor landing of the new building that was the frontage of the Royal Oak Public. Her complaints went on for a few more days. One other complaint was that each time she switched her bedroom light on, she received an electric shock. The landlord brought in an electrician and insisted he went through all electrical equipment as well as wall sockets, but the electrician could find no fault. What her parents had not mentioned over breakfast that first morning was the terrifying incident they themselves had experienced the night before. They had made their bedroom on the top floor over the frontage of the Royal Oak and with exhaustion had settled in for the night. Within a few moments of lying down in their bed, the most horrendous noise of what seemed like a thunderous whoosh, coming from directly behind them almost through the wall, had brought them abruptly sat upright. The landlord went out onto the landing to investigate. There he found the family cat in a rigid position, face almost like stone, baring her teeth. Her front paws were outstretched, nails out, eyes glaring at the wall. Recognizing the cat was highly distressed, he picked her up and took her into their bedroom. They slept uneasy that night. A few days later, the landlady, while in the back garden and looking up at the Royal Oak's back facade, noticed there were more windows than rooms. She called her husband, and between them they realized there was a room in the attic space of the last attached cottage that was not included in their documents of lease, neither was it accessible from the floor below of the end cottage. They investigated and found a wall had been placed to cut off accesses to the stairs leading up to that room. The landlord and his wife ripped down the wall and found an incredibly old, quite thin, in dimension, staircase leading up to the attic room. Some weeks later, a school friend of their daughter, a young lad whose parents were prominent business people in the town, had stayed over in the bedroom leading off the sitting room. This bedroom was in the attached second cottage directly beneath the newly found room. While sat chatting to the landlady in the sitting room, he confessed he did not really want to sleep in that room again. She asked why, and he told her it felt dark. He said, "I think someone lost their life there, they died, and it was wrong." He was a lovely lad, the landlady went on to say, no reason to disbelieve him. She went on to explain some people are more sensitive to these things. The landlord and his wife decided to change their bedroom, owing to restless nights, and uprooted to the smaller attic room next door. This particular room looked over the much older building at the back, but not so much that you could see the garden behind. Her statement follows. "It was late, the pub was closed, and we had gone to bed. The curtains in our bedroom were closed, but I could see daylight. I sat up and saw a man, in his early 20s, looking up at me from what looked like an orchard, and I was scared. I was much younger, perhaps late teens, and wore a long dress. He was dressed in very old-fashioned clothing and wore a leather apron around his waist. His shirt sleeves were rolled up, his gaze was fixed on me. I stared back from the window. I wanted to ask him to leave me alone, but my fear had taken my voice. As I sat up in bed, I could feel the sweat making my pajamas wet. I don't think I have ever felt a fear like that before. My husband was asleep, next to me, so I had no one to ask for help." She went on to explain, "I knew it wasn't a dream, but equally I could not have looked out of the window from my bed, but I seemed to be seeing what this young lady was seeing. I felt her fear." The landlady went on to explain she had experienced a similar thing many years before. At the time she said it was put down to remote viewing, although I had never heard of remote viewing before, but it made sense. The only difference was the first time it happened I saw what was happening to two people in real time, and when I spoke to them about what I had seen they confirmed I was right. This time I seemed to be seeing and witnessing something through the eyes of a young lady from many years ago. I cannot express enough the fear she felt, I felt. After that I never felt alone, she went on to state. I always felt like I was being watched or just that someone was near me, but I did not know who or why. There were often moving shadows, one might notice, and outside at the back in the hallway between the ladies' and men's toilet there was a heaviness in the air, almost like a depression. A few months later, while in the main bar of the Royal Oak, chatting to a couple of customers, the necklace the landlady was wearing, a gift from a friend living in America, made up of amethyst and buffalo circular bone beads, engraved with faces, on a solid silver chain designed and bought from the Navajo tribe, seemed to be ripped from her neck in front of all to see. It fell to the floor, amethyst and bone faces dispersing all over the place, some bits flying in the air only to land meters away. "What just happened?" her customer asked. By now the landlady and her family were desperately keeping spooky happenings to themselves. They needed the business. Fast forward to 2011 and several tenant landlords had come and gone when a new landlady, by the name of Rachel, purchased the Royal Oak freehold. Rachel, a local lady with an ancestry on the Isle of Purbeck, had worked at the pub some 30 years ago before buying the freehold. At that time, the two cottages on the left-hand side had not been joined to the pub building. She reports she had no feeling or knowledge of the pub being haunted, and no hauntings or spooky happenings had ever been mentioned. However, after buying the pub from the brewery and moving in, things changed for Rachel. She tells us the first weird thing she noticed was half a black cat. She says, it seemed to be halfway through the wall. The wall she was referring to was the inner wall next to the first cottage, which was now the restaurant. She went on to list numerous strange and unexplainable experiences, and states she would often look down and see she was wearing a long old-fashioned dress. The name Mary kept coming to mind, and whenever Mary was mentioned, Rachel would feel pure grief and often very tearful, to the point she felt she may well be Mary or channeling Mary's spirit. The Stevens family, Rachel believes, are at the heart of the hauntings, particularly a man by the name of John Stevens, who goes by the name of Jack, with a connection to a Mary and an Elizabeth. After numerous paranormal experiences, which Rachel felt became more evident as one went higher up into the building, she sought help from her close friend, Terry Powell, a local psychic clairvoyant. I have personally met Terry a couple of times, and for what it is worth, find her considerate, honest, and in no way looking for sensationalism. Rachel and Terry began holding spiritualist circles at the pub to see if they could notice spiritual energies. Many other visitors to the pub had also reported strange and somewhat paranormal experiences while there. One gentleman, who Rachel was showing around, saw an apparition of a lady dressed in a long dress. She was in the cellar, which is at the back of the old building on the right-hand side. As time moved on, Rachel and others believed the paranormal activities were becoming more frequent and even more alarming, rather aggressive, so much so that she purchased the cottage on the right-hand side of the pub and lives there in peace to this day. On one occasion, while in the hallway leading to the ladies' toilets, Terry saw the vision of a blacksmith. He told her the roof needs iron. Rachel found that not only did the roof need iron, but that the roof was in danger of collapse owing to the crossbeams rotting away. Luckily, the roof was fixed, and the danger of roof collapse averted. Another curious message given to Terry, believed to be from a spirit known as Jack, was to find the gun. Rachel had no idea what the message meant. Certainly there was no part of the pub she was unfamiliar with, and if there was a gun to be found, she would surely have found it before now. However, a gun was indeed found. By her father, it was hidden in the inside back of the serving bar. As the hauntings became more frequent, Rachel was aware of a particular bedroom on the top floor of the pub that felt different from the others. She became convinced this room was some kind of vortex, a swirling opening to the spirit world where spirits would enter the pub and not always leave. To this day, Rachel keeps the door to that bedroom firmly closed. Once Rachel had made her concerns regarding the pub being haunted known to local residents, people began to come forward. An ex-landlady's daughter, who had been at the pub around 1997, also came forward with the tales of heavy footsteps late at night going up to the attic bedrooms or leading down from the attic to the first floor landing, exactly as the other landlady's daughter had reported. Many told Rachel of seeing a woman in the older building at the back, stories of never feeling alone in the hallway, between the ladies' and gents' toilets. Another said he looked out at the garden and saw an orchard. One gentleman is convinced he saw a lady, again in the older back building, wearing very old-fashioned clothes that looked like rags that had been stitched together. He states he thought she was sad. Her husband had left to buy pink stone and had not returned. Her name he thought was Edith. Several local women reported an item of jewelry, in particular amethyst, suddenly breaking and flying through the air. Local paranormal investigation teams started to investigate. Word of the extrasensory events even attracted an American paranormal investigation team, and books on all things spooky now included the Royal Oak Pub. Time slips were suggested, a swirling opening to another world, the world of the dead was supposed, and so the claims went on, some being more unearthly than others. Yet, no explanations, in real terms, surfaced. Many years ago, when I visited Rachel at the Royal Oak, we went outside to the back garden, and I pointed out the strange shape of the back half of the building. I told her it was quite obviously much older than the frontage, and I believed, owing to its curious bulbous shape at the right-hand end of the building, that it had been some kind of a kill, a little like an oast house. Although, neither Hurstton nor Swanage have ever been reported as growing hops as a crop, so it may have been for barley or another grain. This would suggest the original old part was in fact an alehouse that brewed its own beer. This makes sense as it's recorded as an inn alehouse long before the 1848 buildings were erected. As we walked around, Rachel took me to what would have been a stable or hay loft. It was clean and we spoke about it for a while, when quite unexpectedly, I noticed what looked like a key. Rachel could not explain why or how it had got there. It was an old key and somewhat rusty. This is the end of chapter 13. Thank you for watching, but before you hop on over to chapter 14, do the kid a favor and please, hit that subscribe button, like and share. I'll see you in the next chapter.